This is the story of Flybe, Flight 046. The story of Flight 046 starts on the cold morning of the 12th of December 2002. At about 2 a.m. on that day, the BAE 146 was de-iced for the first time that winter season. On this day, the plane would be making a few shuttles back and forth between Birmingham and Belfast City. The first shuttle between the two cities was scheduled at 6:55 a.m., and the first three flights went off without a hitch. The plane was back at Birmingham by 11:45 a.m., and the plane waited at the stands at the airport, and it was hit by some snow and sleet. The pilots had a quick discussion among themselves about the need to de-ice the airplane. Since they couldn't find snow or ice settling on the airplane or the planes near them, they decided not to de-ice. In fact, not a whole lot of pilots were opting to have their planes de-iced in that time frame when Flight 046 was on the ground. Only one plane requested to be de-iced in that particular time frame. At 12:40 p.m., Flight 046 was pushed back from the stands. As they were pushing back from the stands, the crew did a flight control check to make sure that all the control surfaces were moving as they should. Better to know about a problem on the ground than when they were going down the runway at massive speeds. Just as a precaution, the crew held the control column at the fully aft position for about 25 seconds so that any water that had accumulated in the elevator could drain out. This was standard procedure. With everything looking good, they taxied to the runway. Once on the runway, the four engines on the BAE 146 were pushed to max power, and they were off. Liftoff was at 12:52 p.m., and the jet soared into the skies of Birmingham, bound for Belfast. The captain kept the plane under manual control till they hit about 3,000 feet, and then the autopilot was turned on, and the plane towards Belfast. ATC wanted the pilots to keep climbing, and they knew they'd have to cut through some icy weather, so the pilots turned on the plane's anti-icing systems to prevent any ice buildup. Picking up some ice right now could cause some problems for them down the road. As they climbed, the captain noticed something strange. The plane was oscillating ever so slightly. Now, the BAE 146 was known to oscillate a bit, but this was different. He noticed that the oscillations were worse when he used the autopilot to manage the vertical profile of the plane in the pitch or the speed mode, but in other settings it wasn't as bad. But this wasn't too much of a concern as they closed in on 24,000 feet. Most of these problems worked themselves out without too much intervention. They then got an alert to let them know that they were within 1,000 feet of their target altitude. The plane should have started to level off at any moment, but it didn't. They kept waiting for the autopilot to level the plane off, but instead it pitched up a bit more and continued to climb. Knowing that something was wrong, the captain disengaged the autopilot in an attempt to manually level the plane, and that is when all hell broke loose. The captain suddenly had a plane that wanted to pitch up violently. He instinctively pushed the nose of the plane down, but that wasn't enough. He used the switches on his control column to push the nose of the plane down by using the trim in an attempt to get the plane under control. It worked, maybe a little bit too well. Now the plane was diving. He pulled back on the yoke. The controls were so heavy that the captain asked the first officer to help him out by pulling back on his yoke. The two men were now struggling to pull this plane out of a dive. As they pulled with all their might, the control column suddenly snapped all the way back, sending the plane into another violent pitch-up. The whole plane shook as it climbed again. The pilots quickly brought the jet under control. The whole ordeal had left the cabin in a mess. Two of the three cabin crew members were standing when all of this happened, and they had fallen down. One of the cabin crew members had sprained an ankle, while the other one had broken a leg. A few passengers also had a few head injuries. With the injured being treated by one of the passengers on board who happened to be a doctor, they put out a pan and started to descend towards Belfast. What's weird is that after the upset, the plane seemed to be more responsive and it flew a lot better, but the crew were not taking any chances. They were going to get this plane on the ground as fast as possible before anything else could go wrong. The plane landed on runway 04, and as soon as the jet came to a stop, emergency services swarmed the plane, bringing their ordeal to an end. So, how did this plane violently lose control over the skies over Europe? The first thing that they did was talk to the pilots and look at the flight data. Both the pilots and the flight data painted the same picture. The plane was oscillating a bit, and then when the autopilot was disconnected, the plane pitched up, sending the jet into a violent climb. The thing is, looking at the data, for most of the flight, the elevators, that is, the control surfaces on the tail of the plane, were working as intended. In fact, during the climb, the autopilot was disengaged and re-engaged multiple times with no issue. But as the data got closer to the upset, it started to look awfully familiar. Upsets like this had happened before. After a very similar upset in February of 1998, they recreated that flight in a design simulator. A design simulator is designed to reproduce the physical aspects of the airplane, like the linkages and things like that. They found out that they were able to recreate the 1998 accident flight if they froze the elevator tabs or if they stiffened up the elevators. Wait, let's take a step back and look at how the elevators on the 146 works. The control inputs are transmitted to the elevators via a series of cables and pulleys. Now, I know I just said that the inputs are transmitted to the elevators, but that isn't really the case. The inputs are first sent to these little slats at the end called servo tabs. Then, when the torsion bars contact the stops, then the elevator as a whole moves. Trim is controlled by the trim tabs on the elevators. Now, in the accident flight and in the 1998 flight, the trim tabs were being cycled up and down. This is because the autopilot was trying to relieve pressure on the servo motor system by pitching up and then down. In the 1998 incident, it was because the elevator servo tab was frozen. Could that have been the cause of this accident as well? Here's the thing, the control checks on the ground uncovered no problems, so the servo tab really did freeze. It did so when the plane was climbing out. The data corroborates this. They found out that the servo tab angles were different to the mean elevator angles, meaning that they were frozen stiff at that angle, which also explained why the plane kept climbing when it hit its target altitude. In most other BAE 146 servo tab jammings, the culprit turned out to be de-icing fluid freezing up and jamming up the controls. Ironic, I know. But for that to happen, the outside air temperature needed to drop to about minus 18 degrees Celsius or minus 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. In the case of Flight 046, the outside air temperature never dropped that low. The lowest that it got was minus 8 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit. But that doesn't mean that de-icing fluid had nothing to do with this accident. You see, the space between the servo tabs and the elevator is quite small, 0.5 millimeters to be exact. That's by design, and that's not a whole lot of space. When inspecting the plane after landing, they found out that the gap was filled with dried up de-icing fluid. When a thin mist of water was applied to the dried up de-icing fluid, the residue got rehydrated and formed this gel in that small crack, filling up that very small hole that was present between the elevator and the servo tabs. This meant that the drain holes in that gap were blocked, and now water ice could immediately accumulate and freeze, thus freezing up the servo tabs. Yeah, it is truly ironic that ultimately de-icing fluid helped build up ice in this situation. But that's not the only thing that could have frozen up on this flight. The servo tab operating rods are connected to the servo tabs by the means of a ball race type joint. If you don't know what that means, I'll have a picture of it on screen right now. These joints have bearings inside them. They're greased and they're sealed for life inside the joint. That's how they're manufactured. There's no way to get inside them and re-grease them. That's how they are for the course of their life. But due to where they're located, they're exposed to a lot of high pressure water and de-icing fluid. It was found that under certain conditions, the high pressure water and fluid could erode the seal and make it inside the joint and erode away the grease, making the joint more stiffer, thus making movement harder. When they tore down the bearings, they found out that there wasn't a whole lot of grease in the joint. Instead, they found a brown residue. But here's the thing, the seals were never compromised in the joint. Upon inspection, they found out that the grease had thickened over the years, and that led to a drop-off in performance of the joint. The final thing that they looked at was the response of the crew to this upset. They really weren't trained for this. No crew was at the time. There was no frozen servo tab checklist. That being said, the crew did a good job in responding to the situation with the information that they had available to them. Again, they had no idea what would work and what wouldn't. In this case, what they did worked. Thankfully, the pilots were able to recover from the upset and get this plane on the ground safely. There's no telling how bad this could have been if the pilots had not kept their cool. The BAE 146 is one of my favorite planes. It just looks so unique. It's so small and has 4 engines. It looks great. There are a lot of interesting incidents concerning the BAE 146. If you want to watch another video like that, then I'll have a link to another one of my videos on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.